there was a way for us to essentially have a Line 6 Helix without actually having a Line 6 Helix? You might be wondering what I'm talking about. Well, I did a video last week where I was showing how we could expand kind of the power of our Helix Native software by using MIDI control. And that got me thinking about the possibility of, for let's say, live performance or rehearsal outside of the studio, if it would be possible to use a computer setup with Helix Native and let's say a MIDI controller to come as close as we possibly can to having a full-blown Line 6 Helix. And then I thought, would it be worth it? What would the cost be? Would it just be better to buy the Helix and forget about everything else? In this video, we're going to explore some of those things and see if maybe we could put together a system with Helix Native that could rival the full-blown Helix floor processor. So what, in fact, would we need to come close to having a so-called makeshift Line 6 Helix? The real problem would be, what would it cost to get us all the things we need? So what do we need? Well, number one, you would need a computer that could run Helix Native. Within that computer, you would need some sort of host for the plugin, as it does not have a standalone version of the software. So you're likely going to need a DAW within your computer. Now, here's the interesting thing. Some folks, a lot of folks in fact, already have a fairly powerful computer, maybe a laptop, which would be very mobile. And a lot of them already have some form of recording software that could load Helix Native. So this video is maybe more geared towards the folks who already have that. If we didn't have that and we had to purchase a laptop, purchase a DAW, purchase a recording interface, then the cost would probably very quickly get beyond what it would cost to just get a Helix LT or a full-blown Helix floor. But let's go with the assumption that a lot of folks actually have a laptop that would run Helix Native perfectly fine. Well, if we go with that and you say, well, now what else would we need? Well, we would need a piece of software, like I mentioned, a DAW. We would need a recording interface of some sort, a USB audio interface, which would act as our means of getting our guitar tone into and back out of the computer to a front of house or to maybe a power cab or whatever it is we're using to monitor. We would likely also need to have a way to control it, so some sort of a MIDI controller. So if we broke this down and looked at the cost of these, if we had to purchase a laptop or a computer host system, it's going to quickly get very expensive. So let's take a look at it coming from the standpoint that a lot of folks will already have a laptop. So what do we have here? Well, we have the Helix Native software itself, which sells for $399.99. Now, there are times where that goes on sale, and the folks at Line 6 put a nice discount on it, and that would probably be the time to grab it. If you already do own a Helix floor or even an HX Stomp, you can get it for $99, which is quite an attractive price for it. What about a MIDI controller? So something like the Morningstar MC3, which would be a 3-button controller from my good friends over at Morningstar Effects, would go for $179. Moving up to their MC6 would be $229, and moving up to their MC8 would be around $309. I really love my MC8 as it's much more flexible with more buttons, but let's even just go to the middle ground on something like the MC6. We are going to have to add another $229 to that. That still leaves us with needing an audio interface to get into the computer. Something like a Steinberg UR22 Mark II USB audio interface over here at Sweetwater is $169.99. Now you might ask why I chose this. This also includes a light version of Cubase, so Cubase AI DAW software, which we're going to take a look at later in this video to see how it actually works with Native. Now, there are obviously other choices for audio interfaces that could be even less expensive. We are going to obviously need an interface that has an instrument input, which the UR22 does. So when we look at the final cost of getting ourselves Helix Native at full price, an audio interface, and something like the MC6 MIDI controller, we end up right around $798.98. Now we're approaching the price of a Helix LT, which sells at a street price of about $999. So we would be about $200 less than a Helix LT. But I think the real question is how functional would this system be? And what would some of the pros and cons be to it? And let's take a look at that. So by no means will this be an exhaustive list, but I went through and gave some thought to what some of the potential pros and cons of each system would be. Taking the full-blown Line 6 Helix floor, I mean, some of the pros would obviously be it's an all-in-one system, plug and play, ready to go. We don't have to patch cables together. It's very easy to use. It's also probably much less likely to quote-unquote crash. We do know that computer-based systems, lots can go wrong. The operating system can do strange and funny things. The software that's hosting native can do strange and funny things. So that is definitely a concern. The Line 6 Helix has wonderful latency, to the point where I've played it many times live and I don't really notice any latency that gives me any issues. Now, what would the cons be to the Line 6 Helix floor versus having the computer-based system with Helix Native? Well, there is a potential for limited CPU processing power. I personally don't oftentimes run into a huge issue with that, but there are folks who like to use a lot of very DSP heavy effects. So we can sometimes run out of processing power if we want to use maybe multiple amps or some of the new poly pitch effects. One of the cons of the full-blown Helix would possibly be the price, depending on what we already have as far as a computer and what we need to add on to it. Now, what would some of the pros and cons be on a computer-based system with Helix Native? Some of the pros would definitely be the potential CPU freedom, depending on how powerful our computer is. Obviously, the more powerful computer you have or you're going to buy, it's going to be more expensive to have that. But as I mentioned before, a lot of us already have quite powerful laptops and computers that we could use for this purpose. So that brings us to the fact that it could be potentially cheaper to get set up with a computer-based Helix Native system if we already do own a computer that would do the job for us. One other pro is that now we would also have an audio interface which we could use for other needs. Now, what would some of the cons be to the Helix Native-based system? Well, it's component-based and it makes setup a lot more difficult. We're going to have to be able to get our MIDI controller to talk to Helix Native through whatever DAW software we are using. We also do have the possibility for software crashes or operating system crashes, which may or may not be acceptable to some folks, that they just don't want to take the chance of having that happen in a live situation. But if you feel you have a very solid system that you don't have problems with, that might not be such a concern. One other big thing is on Helix Native is that not all MIDI functions are working as of yet. For instance, something like tap tempo and also things such as recall of presets is not functional on the VST version of Native at this point. Another potential issue could be the lack of ins and outs on your audio interface. If you decide to go with a slightly less costly audio interface, then you're going to very likely have less inputs and outputs. Maybe you're not even going to have MIDI inputs and outputs, which you might need for MIDI control. So those are just some of the things I thought about that would really have to be taken into consideration before making the decision that you were going to say, no, I don't need a Helix floor. I can just go with my computer laptop and I can get Helix Native with an audio interface and everything's going to be fine. As you dive into these things and think them through, you know, everybody's use is going to be a little different. So we may come up with things that we find are a deal breaker. Maybe you need tap tempo and you need it to be very simple. Maybe there is a way to do that within the DAW. I don't know. It really depends on what software you're using, and maybe there's a workaround for that. Or maybe you just don't need tap tempo and it's not a deal breaker for you. So you just move on. You know, if you're running the VST version, do you mind going up to your laptop and mouse clicking to another preset instead of being able to send it via program change, which is available in different formats of Helix Native? I always use VST, so that's what I'm used to. How much latency is our audio interface going to have? How powerful is our computer? Is it going to be able to run what we need it to run? So let's do this. Let's go over to my computer where I've downloaded a trial version of Cubase AI, which is the same software as far as I understand that ships with the Steinberg UR audio interface. And I'm just on a 30-day trial here. I'm usually a Cubase Pro 11 user, so I have that. But I wanted to try this out, see if I could get Helix Native working very smoothly with the lighter version of Cubase that's included with the audio interface. I don't have the Steinberg audio interface here, so I'm going to be plugged into my IK Multimedia Axe.io, just like I would with any other audio interface. And that is another interface that would be an option, which works really nicely. So let's take a look and see how this works out for us. So here we are over in Cubase Elements, and I've just opened up an instance of Helix Native. I went through the same process as I did in my video that I did last week, which I'll link to below, in how to set up MIDI with Cubase into Helix Native, and you'll notice if you look up at snapshot, I have my Morningstar MC6 Mark II MIDI controller already set up to switch between snapshots. It's working beautifully. I also have another button here to show you that I can use it to bypass effects. Very nice stuff, very useful, very easy to set up. I have an instance of a Minotaur through a Tweed Blues norm. I literally just picked these blocks, didn't even hear what this sounded like. So we hear it works fine, much like the Helix would. That tone is not that great, but I did nothing to it other than pull up these blocks to see if they work and set them up. So that's it. So we could keep adding to this. Now, like I said before, one interesting thing in Helix Native here, and this is one of the giant pros to having a native-based system. If we click the little settings button in the bottom left corner and go to hardware compatibility, we can make Helix Native compatible with Helix Floor LTN Rack, or HXFX, or HX Stomp, or HX Stomp XL. So we could mimic using the hardware that we possibly have. Maybe we have an HX Stomp and we got the $99 version of Native, but we would like to go deeper and use more than the 8-block limitation or the CPU limitation of the HX Stomp. So we could go set it for Helix Floor, and then that's going to mimic the limitations of Helix Floor. But when I turn this off, this will allow me now to use the limits of my built-in CPU in my computer. So if we have a powerful computer, this could be very useful. And this is kind of interesting because I can do silly things like this where I could say, continually add, one instance of poly pitch after another. I could likely just copy and paste these in there. And you will see here kind of an interesting thing, and I'm going to keep filling this up. I did a test before where I actually filled both paths completely with poly pitches. Now, what's interesting about that is we can then grab our CPU monitor here within Cubase, and you'll see right now that I'm really kind of crapping out here. I don't know what this is going to sound like. Right? I'm still able to play. You can see we're dangerously close to the CPU being maxed out. That's because I have the latency set as low as I can get it on here. So obviously the lower the latency, the more demand there's going to be on the CPU. So these are the things we have to think about. And it's going to be up to us to decide exactly what our needs are and if this is going to be able to do it for us. But the funny thing is I am still actually able to function here. I don't have it set to path 2, so we're not listening to this. We're just utilizing the CPU. But I am hearing some audio clicks and pops. So what happens if I get rid of one of these? Let's take a look down here at our CPU meter. If I get rid of one instance, 2 instances, I'd be probably living a little dangerously there up that high. Get rid of another. You see the CPU on the peaks is kind of really up in the danger zone, but the average is still down kind of low. So if I get rid of those and let's just come down and say, what if we wanted to add, a whole pile of different amps? I'll put a US Princess. We're not going to hear this thing because I'm not routing through that path. Just keep adding US Princess amps here. So you can see we're actually able to add a whole lot of stuff going on here, and pretty interesting and very, very interesting to see what we can actually get away with. So this is how it sounds being routed right through this very inexpensive Cubase AI software that's included with a relatively inexpensive audio interface. And I feel the latency is fine for my use. I know some people are a little more sensitive to it. I've never been super sensitive to that, although I obviously don't like super high latency where it changes the feel of what we're playing. So that is definitely a thing we have to take into account. But the neat thing is, like I said, I have the MIDI controller set up to switch snapshots, to bypass certain effects. I don't have that tap tempo capability. So we see that even if we load this up with things that we could never do on the Helix, tons of poly effects, multiple amps, maybe I'm really trying to push the limits here a little bit. But it just shows that we could probably even go further than we normally would, especially if you're just an HX Stomp user and you can get the $99 Helix Native. It really opens up a new world of possibilities, and it is kind of interesting. But, to create just a normal kind of preset here, with, amp, distortion, delay, some reverb. Pick an amp I actually like a little bit more. We can do some nice stuff. So really, what's the conclusion here? The conclusion is probably going to be different for everybody and what your needs are. The pros and cons I went over are things we should think about before setting a system up. I think the real point here is there's a lot of folks who already do have a decent computer and a decent audio interface. And add to that Helix Native with the MIDI controller, and a lot of folks may have never thought of this as a potential use for rehearsing or for live use. But it can with a reliable system, and we're going to know more about that ourselves by being more familiar with what we have and what its capabilities are. We could actually be set up with a very powerful, very, very powerful system, even more so than the Helix Floor, with things that we already own, and maybe we were afraid to try, or maybe we just never thought of it. And it's just some food for thought. And that's all this video is designed to do, is get you kind of thinking about some of the tools that we already have, or maybe that we can add a couple little things such as a Morningstar MIDI controller, which can really add a lot of power to Helix Native, as I showed in the video I did last week, where I kind of went in depth on how to set that up. So I just wanted to go through some of these for food for thought, some pros and cons to both systems. For myself, I really like the fact that I can grab my Helix Floor and be done with it, right? Everything is simple. I put that down on stage. I send it to front of house. I've got my presets set up. I've got an expression pedal in there, done. And that's another thing some folks might be asking about, how could we add an expression pedal? Well, the Morningstar MIDI controllers have the ability to add expression pedals to it as well. So that's very, very useful also, and they work really well. In fact, that's exactly how I integrate into my HX Stomp pedal board expression pedal uses via the MC8 that I have on there. So anyways, I don't know, maybe I've missed some stuff. Please let me know in the comments what your thoughts are about the whole thing. Because like I said before, it's really going to depend on everybody's particular needs, what they're going to use in their situations. But maybe with what we already own, the idea of a Helix Native based live setup makes a lot of sense, and we would feel comfortable with that. And then, like I said, we have the pros of having our computer audio interface for studio work as well. So just some food for thought. I thought it would be a fun video to make and to have a little discussion about. So thanks so much for tuning in. Please like the video, share it with anybody you think would get some use or enjoyment out of watching it. Subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell notification to get notified when I put new content out, and I'll be back really soon with some more. Thanks so much for tuning in, everyone. Ciao for now.